I don't know.
Because this either, we're going to need the two cordless ones. Ready?
I'm sitting here enjoying the music, right?
Yeah.
And thinking, pronounce Nigun.
Nigun.
And, okay. I hear Gershwin's Porgy and Bess.
Oh, yeah?
I sort of do. But it all sounds like the blues to me, but not sad.
Well, he also learned to play some blues. He did. Yes. It's on. I'm going to turn it off. Hello. This is really loud. Okay, is this pretty good? Can you hear me like this? Very good. I'm Julie Moss. I'm the librarian here at Park Synagogue, and it's nice to see everybody. I see friends. I see book groups who I suggested the book to, and I see lots of Park members. And welcome to all of you and everyone else who's visiting Park Synagogue for the first time. Just outside of the sanctuary is the library. It's the Leonard Sankfor Library, and inside the library is the Judy Kaufman Park Synagogue History Display. Everything's named for someone. In the library, we feature many popular books on topics ranging from Israel to popular fiction written by Jewish authors. Please stop in to visit today or anytime, peruse the displays, and borrow a book or two. Everyone in our community is welcome to borrow books from us, and the library is open whenever the synagogue is open. The hopes and ideas for tonight's program came about many months ago when my ACE volunteer, Deborah Glass, borrowed a new book and read it. Then she read it again. Then she said, "Julie, you have to read this book." We both enjoyed it very much, and of course the book was The Last Decrepitzer. You'll hear more about what that word means later on. Several weeks later, Deborah reminded me that her family's Robert and Marjorie Stein Fund was available to spend and said, "Let's plan a program." So with Deborah standing there, I said, "Okay, I'm going to email Howard Langer's law firm in Philadelphia, see if he answers and see if he wants to come." Well, he replied to me from his personal email right away, and he said, yes, he'd love to come. In fact, his wife, Barbara Jaffe, Barbara, are you here? Nice to meet you. She's from Cleveland, and they were married at Park Synagogue in Cleveland Heights. So the evening was beshert, and we're so glad that they're both here. Howard Langer has a master's degree in literature, but went on to lead a distinguished career as a lawyer and teacher. Always yearning to write a novel, it wasn't until a few years ago, at the age of 70, that he began. During COVID, his son had suggested that he watch a Zoom workshop by the writer George Saunders. Encouraged by what he learned, Langer began to write this book. He wrote 60 pages in longhand, in pencil. 2 years later, the book was finally finished, and 2 years after that, it was published. Winning a 2024 National Jewish Book Award in the category of book club was, I'm sure, a pleasant surprise. Mazel tov for that, Howard. Interviewing Langer will be Dr. Regina Williams, Distinguished Scholar of African American History and Culture at the Western Reserve Historical Society. We're about to hear in their conversation how Shmuel Lichtbencher and his incredible post-Holocaust journey came to be. We'll also learn a thing or two about the blues and the nigunim that were played to express Sam's feelings to God. Finally, the thank you portion. Thank you to the Robert and Marjorie Stein Fund, to the Park Synagogue staff for helping prepare for tonight, to my friend Beth Rosenthal from the JCC, As a matter of fact, Beth has asked me to give a little plug for the JCC Jewish Book Festival that's coming up, starting soon. And a program note, there's an author named Lihi Lapid who was supposed to come on November 10th, and she's now going to be presenting on November 13th at 11 a.m. So hopefully there'll be more reminders about that if you were planning to see her. I know hers is a book I'm really anxious to read. Also, thanks to Steve Greenman for playing the delicious violin music that we have heard and we will hear more of later. There'll be a dessert reception, book sale, and signing after their conversation, so I'm going to hand it over to the two of you.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and thank you, Mr. Langer, for a wonderful book. It makes me wish that I had not resigned from that position in the history department at Cleveland State, because this would work, I think, very well in a survey course of American history in the post-World War II era. So thank you so much for that. Can we begin our dialogue by talking about inspiration? If you tell me where that came from, and then tell us about this book for people who may not have read it yet. What is it about?
The book begins in a subway station in New York.
I think it's on, but
Hello? Well, I'll be eating it if I hold it any closer. Hello? Okay. It's a little weird. I might bite it while I'm talking. The book begins in a subway station in New York in the 1960s. No. How's this? Better? Okay. The book begins in a subway station in New York in the 1960s, and there's a man fiddling in the subway station, and he's fiddling a combination of blues, gospel, and nigunim. And a passerby seems to recognize the nigunim and ends up in a discussion with him, and the man who's white speaks black English, and as a result of their discussion, he realizes that this man is the Decrepitzer Rebbe, the last survivor of the sect of the Decrepitzers. And the Decrepitzers, who are totally fictional, were known for, the Rebbes were known for leading their flock, their sect, by fiddling. And the rest of the book really is an explanation of how he ended up fiddling in the subway station. So you kind of begin the book with the ending, and he begins in the shtetl in Poland. Very quickly it moves to Naples, where he falls in among some black soldiers who bring him back to Mississippi. He lives in Mississippi for several years, has to flee to New York after a cross burning, lives in New York for a number of years, and then ultimately moves to a chicken farm in New Jersey, where the book kind of ends. But it's this saga through all these different places that the book is about.
yes, I think it's, again, an amazing story, but what inspired you to write about Sam?
What inspired me to write about Sam? Well, the truth is that as Julie just explained, I watched this presentation by George Saunders, and I said, one of the things he said three things that really were very, very influential to me. First, he said, and most importantly, if you want to write, you got to stop talking about it, you got to stop thinking about it, you got to sit down and do it. I said to myself, I'm 70 years old. If I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? So I actually started writing the very next morning, but it wasn't exactly the book that came out. The second thing he said is that when you're writing, you have to remember that the goal is to always get the reader to turn to the next page. And that was always on my mind. And the third thing he said is there's no end to revision. And I was revising it even after it was set in type. So those three things that he said were very, very influential to me. As to what inspired me to write it, it's very hard to say because the book wasn't something that I had a concept of when I began writing. I first thought that I wanted to write, if I was going to write something, I wanted to write something that would ameliorate the tensions between the black community and the Jewish community. And I had different ideas to what I was going to write. I was going to try and write a book about, in black English, about black soldiers liberating a concentration camp. Somehow, and I really, part of the issue with age is you don't remember everything. I don't remember how it morphed from that into a short story. But the short story is the prologue to the book, is just the story of this Rebbe fiddling in the New York subway station. And that story eventually got published in a magazine. And someone who knows me very well said to me, Howie, that is not a short story, that's a novel. I thought, come on, it's 8 pages. No, it's a novel. I went home, I said, that woman knows you better than you know yourself. If she says it's a novel, it's a novel. So it may be a novel. I said the obvious question was, how did he end up in the subway station? And I really had no idea how he ended up in the subway station. In fact, when I started writing, I thought he was a recluse living in a walk-up in New York all by himself, just totally isolated and so on. And early drafts of the book had him doing that. But what can I say? Slowly the ideas of where he went and how he did things, they just came to me along the way. I didn't write the book in a chronological way. Different scenes occurred to me at different points in time, and eventually they got stitched together into a chronology. So in the end, I suppose what I did was, rather than writing about black soldiers freeing Jews, I ended up turning a rabbi into something of a black person and a black woman into something of a Jewish Rebbitzin. And it just morphed that way.
I've heard it said that you should never judge a book by its cover. But I must tell you, I love the cover. And I saw the violin, and I said, I'm going to love the book. And I was not disappointed, because it took me back to my years as an elementary school student at A.J. Rickoff in the Mount Pleasant community here in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. I guess I'm not in Cleveland at the moment, but this is greater Cleveland, right? So, Mount Pleasant, Cleveland. Because for a time it was a Jewish community, and people just kept moving further east. And I was on the lower end of Kinsman, and I had made my way from 78th Street to 147th, and that's when I was introduced to the violin. And I've loved it ever since. I can't play like him, with all of the pathos and emotion. But I like the idea that no matter where I start in this book, and I had to close it sometimes, because it's so sad. He's burying bones. There's nobody left, and I have to stop. But there is music, even in those moments. There are prayers in those moments. But at what point did you decide that music would remain at the center of his being and his life?
Well, let me tell you where I got the idea, okay? There was a great Hasidic rabbi who was known as the Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto, known as the Pesachner Rebbe, and I mentioned him in the afterword. And he wrote weekly talks that were eventually put in what was called the Ringelblum Archive. They were put in milk cans, and after the war, he was killed, but after the war, they found all of his writings, which extended from the beginning of the ghetto till the end, the weekly talks about the Torah readings. And And he's known today as the Eish Kodesh, the holy fire. But I had read this, someone wrote a dissertation that was published about him, and what I read was that before the war, he led his Hasidim by fiddling. And that's where I got the idea for the fiddling, was from this person. The book is not the least bit about him. I wouldn't even presume to try and recreate what he does in his own writings. But that's where I got the idea for the fiddling. And then it was a short step from that to one of the themes of the book is that the Rebbe cannot pray. He does not pray in words anywhere. He just fiddles, and his fiddling is kind of in defiance of God because words are meaningless to him. You find out in the book that he basically holds the entire Jewish canon in his head. He can do what's called the pin trick, where you turn to any page in the Talmud, put a pin in the front of the Talmud, and he'll tell you which word it passes throughout. He has, that kind of, and supposedly people could do that, but he's able to do it. So he carries all of this in his head, but it's, as a result of his experience in the war, it's all useless because he believes that the covenant with God was broken, but he has no doubt that there is a God. So his fiddling is kind of constantly in defiance of God, but no words except for a couple of isolated places.
There's, I already warned you, I have favorite historians and sociologists too. But since I know you're from Philadelphia, maybe you'll appreciate this question. And if not, you'll change the subject. You warned me about that. But this book caused me to think a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois and his wonderful collection of essays, at least in my opinion, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. But one of the things that he said was the problem of the 20th century, and this is set in the 20th century certainly, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relationship between the lighter and darker races of men in Asia, in Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. And it was that problem of the 20th century that was also a problem in the 19th century and led to the creation of this institution known as chattel slavery, and it was still a problem at the dawn of the 20th century. So there's some of that here too. There's still, certainly in Mississippi it seems to me, this obsession with race, but there's more than that. At least the way I think Sam experiences life in rural Mississippi. Would you agree with that, or would you change the subject?
Well, I don't know whether I agree or disagree because I don't know whether I really understand the question. But
race in America in the 20th
well,
century.
Well, obviously, people say, that the thing about the book that's so strange is how do you write this book about a Hasidic Rebbe who ends up, in the middle of the pre-civil rights era in Mississippi? It's kind of a funny juxtaposition of ideas. And I don't know why I ended up doing it quite that way, but it was a very important thing to me. The Rebbe is white, but he speaks black English. So he's cut off in two ways. He's cut off from the black community because he's white. He's cut off from the white community because he speaks black English. People mistake him for being black. At different points in the book, people ask him, he himself at different points says, when people ask him what he is, he says, I don't know, I am what I am, is what he says. And his wife, who converts to Judaism, who's a black woman, finds herself equally at a loss in the Jewish community when they move to New York because there's no acceptance, there's nobody for her to join with, but because she's become Jewish, she's also isolated from the only blacks that she knows in New York who can't quite understand how she gave up her Christianity. So for me, race in the book was more of a way of describing the isolation of all of the different characters and how cut off they were from society.
Thank you. There was another theme also that that seemed to be very important throughout the book, and it's this, for me, was this idea of home And just wondering how you would define home, or how you actually did define home for him in the early chapters of the book, and just wondering if you would say that he ever found another home. He seems to be searching for a lot, but are you satisfied that he found a home?
No, no, he never finds a home. There is no home for him. The book begins, the first 20 pages, it's not really even the first 20 pages, about half of the first 20 pages take place in the shtetl. And it establishes where he comes from, how he was being groomed to be a Rebbe, and the amazing scholarship he got, and how he was taught the nigunim, the songs to fiddle that his sect had. And that had to be there because you had to know where he came from, what he was. But that home was totally destroyed. He is at home in Mississippi mainly because he's totally alone, right? He's really, the black people there kind of treat him nicely. They don't know what to do with him, but he's there. He's got his own little chicken farm, and he lives by himself. And I guess he would have been happy there with his wife had, they not been driven from Mississippi to New York. He's certainly not at home in New York. When they end up in the farm in New Jersey, they're only home because they're isolated, but they're not really home.
Can we talk a little bit about the drive from Mississippi, why he has to leave, and why people were upset with him because of how he was living?
I'm not sure I understand, but
Well,
basically...
Well, if I say the Ku Klux Klan,
okay.
Why they were upset.
Well, it's interesting, because people told me that historically, what I wrote there isn't really very accurate. Okay, basically what happens is the Rebbe converts and marries a black woman, and his own personality is a little hard to fathom at these points in the book, because he's been through so much, and having lost his first family, and not having been in concentration camps, but having seen as a soldier in the Russian army the results of what the Germans had done, he's closed up. He's not going to fall in love with somebody in any way that he's going to acknowledge. He's not going to let himself become involved that way. And he gradually becomes involved with this woman who's very strong-willed, and I would say she almost forces her way into his life. And he converts her very appropriately under Jewish law, and they marry. And it's when they have a child that the problems begin, because you can't live all by yourself, even buried in the Delta in Mississippi. When you have a child, eventually he's going to have to be somewhere. And as one of the characters says to him, the rabbi actually tells him, a circumcised black child, if anything happens with the child, bring him to me and we'll bring him to Jackson, which is a bigger city, because people start asking questions down here. And eventually there is this cross burning and he has to flee. But I don't know if that answers what you were asking me or not.
I think it does, because it's the Ku Klux Klan members,
Right.
the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who are burning the cross.
Right.
We can't have a white man, Jewish or not, we can't have a white man marrying a black woman. It's against the law, all the anti-miscegenation laws that have been on the books for years. And he has to leave because he's shooting at the Klansmen.
Well, he's shooting over their heads, but he's shooting
he
at them.
didn't hit anybody, but still. He
Yes.
picked up the gun.
Correct.
That was a no-no. Yeah, and they make their way to New York. Not together,
No.
but they are reunited. So I'm always looking for the happy ending. And I suspected at that point, when I saw that they were going to get back together in New York, that there might be a happy ending or a resolution with music.
Well, I've told the story a million times, and my poor wife who's sitting here has had to hear it over and over and over. But, originally the wife, as I told you, my concept was that he was going to be all alone in that subway station in New York. And when he finally does get the wife in Mississippi, I convinced myself that my story was going to be that their marriage was going to fall apart when they moved to New York because of the tensions on an interracial couple in the 1950s. And he was going to be all alone. And what happened is I said I'm a lawyer, and I had this client in a pro bono case, a lovely African-American woman who was a docent at one of the stops of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. And I was having trouble imagining what those pressures would be that would break up the marriage. So I asked her if she could have lunch with me and help me out. And I described the book to her at lunch, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Langer, I can't help you." I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, that love between those two, no pressures, in New York were going to break up that marriage." And I'm thinking, oh man, I'm picking up the check for this lunch. I'm getting nothing out of it. So I said to her, "Well, you know what that means, Mrs. So-and-so?" She said, "What?" I said, "Well, the wife's going to have to get cancer." And she said to me, no, Mr. Langer, you would never do that. You'll ruin your book. She's a wonderful character from what you're saying. And really, that woman changed the trajectory of the second half of the book. And she becomes, for those of you who've read it, a lot of people think she's the main character in the second half of the book.
I love the way you handle all of the various tensions associated with religion and spirituality, and also shine a light on what was for me the diversity that exists within, and I'm going to do the quotes in the air, at least with one hand, the Jewish community. It's just, for me, like talking about the Black community, because sort of monolithic approach to, studying people of color, or especially the descendants of the formerly enslaved people in places like Mississippi. But when I think about his education, and especially the role of music, singing and dancing to this sort of mysticism and ecstasy that was so important to his community, his home community. It was something, I don't like to use the word shun, but something that other members of the Jewish community frowned upon. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that I should write a book about Hasidim or a Chassid, because I come from a very, what we call the Misnagdisha family, people who were pretty anti-Hasidic. I wasn't, but certainly one of my grandfathers. Let me put it this way, we would always, on Friday nights, he would go to the shul that was Shlomo Carlebach's father's shul. And we would go there, and my grandfather would repeat to me, Shlomo Carlebach's father was a kind of German rabbi, not Hasidic at all, and he said, he once said something bad to a Chassid, and he put a curse on him that his son would be a Chassid. And so that's where I came from. That was my childhood view. So what happens in the book is, in the beginning, when he's in yeshiva, still in Poland, he fiddles on Saturday nights after Shabbat, and the other students dance wildly and have, writhe on the floor and whatever, have what they think is a mystical experience. But it's viewed very skeptically by the Rosh Yeshiva there. And later in the book, the protagonist has an actual, I don't know, this is a spoiler issue, but he has something of a divine revelation, which is genuine. In other words, as compared to what went on in the yeshiva, which he considered artificial, he has an epiphany that's very real. So I suppose that there's a kind of mixed approach to that kind of thing. There's no question that the whole relationship to God of the protagonist is through music. It's an antagonistic one. And maybe I should read that section that I was telling you about.
Yeah, would you please?
before. So what I'm going to read to you is the person who is on the deathbed is Harold Carr, and he's the father of one of the black soldiers who had brought the Shmuel Meyer, the protagonist, to Mississippi, who basically saved him. And Harold and the protagonist, Shmuel Meyer, do develop a kind of relationship in the book together. So this is on Harold's deathbed. Harold Carr had been hemorrhaging and coughing up blood. Willie had driven him up to the New Negro Hospital in Mound Bayou, but they could do nothing for him. He'd been bedridden since they returned. Harold sent Willie to fetch Shmuel Meyer. Harold looked small, buried in the sheets. Shmuel Meyer sat down by his bedside and took his hand. Harold stared at him and moved his lips before the words came. "Young man, I asked you when you first came here if you were a rabbi. You remember that?" "I remember." "You ain't answer me straight." "No, I didn't." "You a rabbi, ain't you?" "Yes, I'm a rabbi." "You pray for me, rabbi." "I've been praying for you, Mr. Carr. I pray for you all the time." "What's your prayer?" "I pray for the healing of your body." "My body's finished, rabbi. Best pray for my soul." "Mr. Carr, your soul pure. You raised your boy, and he volunteered and went and fought against the great evil overseas. Taught him goodness so that in the end, he saved me. You took me in when I ain't had nothing and treated me like your own. Your soul pure. Your life been good and filled with kindness." "No, rabbi. My soul's all soiled with sin. I need your prayers." Reverend Birchwood, he'd say, he pray for me, but you, rabbi, I need your prayer. "You dead wrong, Mr. Carr. Your soul pure, if any soul pure. But you can have any prayer from me you ask. But why is my prayer so important? Because you seen him like nobody else here's ever seen him. The Bible don't got nothing to match that which you done seen. Your prayer will be a special prayer. When the time comes, I'll pray for your soul. I brought my fiddle to bring you some music. My music a prayer too." "No, prayer needs to be with words. That's how we learned." "I'll pray for you. I'll pray for your body so long as you have a breath of life, and I'll pray for your soul when your soul is released. It ain't the custom for my people to pray for the soul while there's still life in the body. With words and music. In the Hebrew language that Birch would say is his language. In the Hebrew language, the only language I can pray in. But here, I'll play you a nigun like I played back when we first met." He started a nigun that was part of his grandfather's morning prayers, but then stopped. Harold turned his head and said, "Fix me, Jesus." Shmuel Meyer played and the sick man rasped, "Fix me, Jesus, fix me, oh fix me, oh fix me. Fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my long white robe, fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my starry crown, fix me, Jesus, fix me." Days later, when Harold died, Shmuel Meyer stood outside his shack looking out at the coops that they'd built together and recited the traditional prayer for his soul, El Mole Rachamim, in the language that was his language. The opening words, "God filled with mercy," stuck in his throat. And he forced his way through to the words, praying that Harold's soul would rest eternally in Eden among the holy ones. Then he took up his fiddle and prayed until his bow arm gave out. So I kind of felt that kind of combined both of the themes in the book, really.
It's interesting. All of it's interesting to me, but especially interesting the way that his wife, Lula, came to love him and understand him, that he knows that there is a God. He is angry at God because the covenant's broken and there's been so much death and so much suffering. He has lost so much. But at the same time, it seems to me that God has allowed him to find a wife. and together they have this son. And it seems to me that there is hope in the midst of this situation where he's still homeless, sort of, at the end of the book. But that little Moses, he loves that child. Can you say something about the love that he shows for his son?
I don't know. I actually, let me go a step back. I really found it hard to describe how the love between him and his wife develops. Okay? I found that very hard. What she saw in him and why he breaks down and finally lets her in, even though he only lets her in a little chink into his life in the beginning. I'll say this, the book in earlier versions had a wee bit more sex in it, but I thought maybe it would be a book they'd use at Jewish high school, so I took it out. But I found it hard to develop that together. But people seem to, when I read what people write about the book, they see it as a love story in a big part, which really blew my mind, because I had a lot of trouble writing the relationship. The son comes, and the irony is the book is called The Last Decrepitzer, but again, a spoiler alert, towards the end of the book, you learn that the son plans on becoming the Rebbe, his black son, and the book doesn't answer the question as to whether he ever does, but yes, he teaches him how to play. There's a parallelism there in which the scenes in the early part of the book in which his father teaches Shmuel Meir how to fiddle, reoccurs in the next generation towards the end of the book. But I'll tell you something kind of funny. I had finished the manuscript, and it was only when I finished the manuscript that I got an editor. And those scenes about the son, they were not in the book. But the editor said to me, you can't have the son and just mention that he has a son and nothing happens. And you can't leave, I had a whole bunch of things that were left hanging. So actually, you should know that those chapters about the son were actually written after I thought the book was over. And I'm happy with them. And I think they add a dimension, and they leave a question as to who the last Decrepitzer actually is. And I was telling Regina beforehand that there was a writer in Harrisburg who read the book, and he so wants a sequel about the son that he sent me an outline of what it should look like.
Okay, again, it's a wonderful book. There are between 200 and 300 pages in the book. I think it would fit well in a survey course of American history for all the faculty members in the audience. Maybe I can teach that class. Julie's giving me that look. I think it's time for the Q&A.
It
But again,
is.
love these themes, and I know we may get questions about other things, but home and place and race and ethnicity, religion and spirituality, music and prayer, and family. Even in situations that, at least on the surface, appear to be hopeless, there is love. So thank you again for a wonderful, wonderful book.
I will come around with the microphone.
Hi, I was very intrigued with Reverend Gary Davis, and you haven't mentioned him at all, and how they played so much together, and the fact that he was blind, and he could tell how beautiful a person was, anything about them without really seeing them, and how open he and his wife were to welcoming Shmuel Meir into their home. Could you talk about Reverend Davis, please?
Yes, I will, very much. I would say the most research I did in writing the book was about the Reverend Gary Davis. The Reverend Gary Davis was a very great guitarist. I guess looking at the people here, you probably may all know the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, If I Had My Way. And he wrote that, well, he got credit for the song, but he really didn't write it, but they gave him credit for the song. And 12 Gates to the City is another song that he really made popular. And for most of his life, he played on the streets of New York. He was blind, but he also was a teacher and taught many very subsequently famous guitarists. One of the members of the Grateful Dead studied with him, and other people. I actually had the opportunity to talk to two of his former students in researching him. But I thought it would be very interesting to contrast the Reverend Davis's music and why he was singing with that of a Hasidic Rebbe. And I thought, wow, what would happen if the two of them were playing together on the streets of New York? It was kind of an experiment for myself. By the time I got to that part of the book, I kind of knew my character. And I'd read so much about Gary Davis that I thought I knew him pretty well, too. The truth is, I'll never understand Gary Davis. I mean, he was a reverend, he was ordained, he was an incredible philanderer. He indeed repeatedly could tell if a woman was beautiful even though he was blind, and had a penchant for young women. But he also, for 25 years it was said, he never sang any profane music, only religious music. And he would every night go preach in churches, and there's actually on Spotify, you can actually hear him speaking in a church service. The speech in my book that he gives is his speech. I just took dictation from the album and recorded it in the book. And I wanted to contrast the two of them because Shmuel Meyer, he plays music really just for God, to defy God. But Gary Davis, he's playing his music to bring people to Jesus and to help redeem their souls, which is very different. And yet the two of them kind of, what shall I say, form a duet together through the book in their contrasting styles. And then another character that I didn't mention who gets much involved in the book is, again, a real person, the Bavava Rebbe, who has his own music and is also very taken with Gary Davis's music. But, you know, just to answer your question a little bit further, I said to myself at one point, wouldn't it be cool to see what would happen if Gary Davis was in the back seat of a car with the Bavava Rebbe? And I said that to myself, let's see what happens, because that's the way the process went. I'd put them together and start writing and see how they related to each other. And because the fact is that the two of them were both, in a sense, tzaddikim, and really understood one another, it worked out very beautifully. They both had tremendous respect for one another's music, even though they were quite things. So I'm glad that you raised Gary Davis, because I hadn't listened to his music probably in 30, 40 years. And then, I decided to do this. And again, my poor wife had to listen to endless Gary Davis in our car because he recorded a vast amount of music. And he's also something of an acquired taste, to put it mildly. Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that.
I would like to know how you came up with the name Decrepitzer.
Well, the truth, you want the truth? The truth is that we used to sit around the Shabbos table, my sons and myself, and we would make up funny names for Hasidic groups. The Tzkracheners, the Decrepitzers, and we would make up these names. And that was long before I heard the George Saunders thing and so on. But the Decrepitzer stuck in my head. I kind of liked it. I thought it does sound like a Hasidic group, right? And the trouble is that most Gentiles can't pronounce the name of the book, which has been a big problem. But But there was a reason that I stuck with it. I stuck with it because I did not like, I don't have the romance of the shtetl in my head. You know, there's a lot of criticism of a certain generation of American Jews who have this fiddler on the roof image of the shtetl, whereas for me the shtetl really was backwards, pretty backwards place. Let's just leave it at that. Very poor, and not something that I would have romanticized or felt very comfortable in myself. And that's why I called it Decrepits. The name of the shtetl is Decrepits, and the people who, you know, are the Hasidim there are the Decrepitzers. So it captured that attitude I had, which is why I kept it that way.
You may have already said this, but how long did it take you from page 1 to the last page to complete this book? And then how many different publishers did you have to contact to get this published?
Oh, well, I think it took about a year until I had a single manuscript of the whole story. But then I spent at least a year editing that. Then I got an editor, and I would say I spent several months with her, and it really, I can't say enough in terms of how much it improved what I had done. The way it works is most publishers won't take a book from a writer. You have to give it through an agent. And I sent it to maybe 60 agents and was universally turned down. But at least a couple of agents told me that they turned it down because the book was unpublishable, because it had so much African-American content by a white author, and it would be considered cultural appropriation. And that they just said it's not going to happen. So I never got an agent during that period. And my editor, look, I'm fortunate. I was a successful lawyer. My editor said, look, I'll put you in touch with a guy who's a book designer. You should publish it yourself, and he'll explain how. So I created the press, Gresham, and I published it myself. And it would have remained in obscurity, but you know, I sent it off to the National Jewish Book Awards. You know, it's not really a contest, I don't know what you'd call it, but to be considered. And the fact that it won that award dramatically changed things. And it's not like it's a bestseller or anything, but at least it gave it significant currency. Now, I think in the next week or two, I actually will have a publisher who's picking it up, a significant publisher.
Last chance for a question, anybody? Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Sherry.
How did you get the idea of how he survived the Holocaust? Had anything inspired you to have it be that he was
Yes.
taken by the Russian army?
Yes. There were two pieces to it, okay? I had read a very wonderful memoir by, hold on a second, I'm just drawing a blank, by, bear with me, by Masha Gessen about her grandmothers, her two grandmothers. And one of her grandmothers was in Russia, so she survived the Holocaust because she was Russian. But the other grandmother lived in Bialystok, and she survived because, as happens with the protagonist in the book, she was taken to Moscow to study agriculture while the Russians had partitioned Poland before the Germans, you know, invaded. So I got the idea of his being taken away to Moscow from having read that in her book about her grandmothers. Then the scenes in the Russian army came from my having read the journals of Vasily Grossman, who was a great Russian writer, a Jewish writer, who was a journalist embedded in the Russian army, and he throughout the war, he first ended up retreating to the east with the Russian army, and then was with them all the way to the west. But his experience was very tragic, because as they moved west, he saw there were no Jews in all of these places where there had been millions of Jews. And his mother, his family were from Berdichev, and his mother was a doctor, and he had wanted to bring her to Moscow, but his wife was against it. So his mother was killed in Treblinka, and this something that prepossessed him the rest of his life, and that he didn't get her out. But he ends up going back to Berdichev and seeing no Jews in this city that was filled with Jews throughout. So a lot of my my picture of what Shmuel Meyer went through, being in the Russian army, came from my reading of Grossman's journalism.
I have one last question that I asked Howard over dinner. I told him that I sort of pictured Shmuel Meyer the size of Woody Allen, I don't know, with the big hat, and you can barely see his face, and a big beard. So I asked Howard to describe how he pictures him in his mind.
And I told her that I didn't really have a picture of him. There are two pictures. There's a picture of him that I kind of sometimes think about, and there's a picture of him as he's described in the book, which doesn't really correspond with that. I was in a bad accident a number of years ago, and as a result of which I find myself in MRI machines pretty often. And when I'm in the MRI machines, I invariably start running the book in my head as a movie and trying to imagine the people. And in that, he's always kind of thin and slight, maybe about 5'9", 5'10". But in the book, it says that he's stocky and that he's got, that he got muscular when he was in the Russian army. So it doesn't really correspond with this image that I run through my head. So the answer is he's whoever you think he is.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for a wonderful hour. And I know everyone will stay for some delicious dessert and to hear some more music, so thank you for coming.